Welcome to Narrative Strokes. I don't remember the delivery. I woke up in a hospital room with a tiny bundle in my arms. She was wrapped in a pale pink blanket, wearing a little white cap with a bow on it. Her eyes were shut, and her nose crinkled a bit when she yawned. They told me I did great. The nurse smiled and said, "Congratulations, Mama," like I had just crossed some finish line. She gave me a plastic cup of water and adjusted my bed, but I don't remember getting here. No contractions, no water breaking, no screaming or pushing, just suddenly here. I figured the meds must have been strong. Maybe they knocked me out for a C-section or something. I was too tired to care. She was here. That was all that mattered. We named her Eliza. We'd picked the name months ago, but it felt different saying it now. I whispered it over and over again just to hear it out loud. Eliza. My husband Neil sat by the bed. He looked pale, with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. When I asked him if everything was okay, he just nodded and said, "Yeah, you're both okay now." I didn't know what that meant. I thought he was just overwhelmed. They discharged me the next day. Neil drove us home. The car ride was quiet. I sat in the back with Eliza, strapped into the car seat that still had the tag on it. I remember watching the houses pass by, but I couldn't remember the route. It felt like we were driving through a version of our neighborhood that had been copied from memory. I kept glancing at Eliza to make sure she was okay. She barely moved, just kind of slept with her tiny fists balled up near her face. I kept thinking, shouldn't she be fussing? Making some noise? But every time I touched her cheek or whispered her name, she stayed asleep, peaceful. Too peaceful. But I guess most babies are lulled to sleep due to the motion of a car. When we pulled into the driveway, I felt this weird pressure in my chest. Not pain exactly, just tight. Like something I was forgetting. Neil carried the hospital bag. I carried Eliza. The nursery was ready. We'd set it up together in the last month. Soft gray walls with a big letter E above the crib's side on the wall. A mobile over the crib with little clouds and stars. A cute little teddy bear in the corner of her crib. Diapers were stacked neatly on the shelf. A glider rested near the window, covered with a white ruffled curtain, and a small little bookshelf near it with baby books in it. Everything was perfect and clean. There wasn't that usual chaos I expected. No signs of last-minute scrambling or the mess of leaving in a rush. It didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off. Maybe Neil had cleaned up while I was in the hospital. That night, I sat in the glider with Eliza in my arms. I stared at her for hours, still not crying. No twitching or gas, no little jerks of her arms, just breathing, slow and quiet. Neil peeked in once, leaning on the doorway. I asked if he wanted to hold her. He looked tired. "In a bit," he said. "I'm going to lie down for a while." I thought that was strange. I mean, it was our first night home. Neil was so excited to be a father, to meet his little princess. I thought we'd both be hovering over her, taking turns, soaking in every second. But I didn't push it. Maybe he was more exhausted than he let on. The next morning, I woke up still holding her. My back was killing me from falling asleep in the glider, but Eliza hadn't made a sound all night. I checked her diaper. It was dry. That was weird. I tried feeding her, but she just kind of rested against me. No rooting, no fussing, nothing. I started to feel this itch in my brain, like something wasn't right. I googled quiet newborns and got 1,000 conflicting answers. Some said it was normal, some said it was a red flag. I called Neil at work and told him I was thinking about calling the pediatrician. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Maybe wait a day or two. She's probably just adjusting." Adjusting to what? Life? Air? Me? I didn't like his tone. It was soft and careful, like he was choosing every word. "Did the nurses say anything?" I asked. "About what?" "About her being so quiet." Another pause. "They said she was fine." But he wouldn't look me in the eye that night, not even when he came home and kissed me on the head. He barely glanced at Eliza, didn't ask to hold her, just went straight to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. I started noticing other things too. My phone never rang, no texts, no congratulatory messages. I knew people had to know by now, at least our parents, my sister, Neil's co-workers. I checked my call log and it was empty. No outgoing, no incoming, just blank. I thought maybe the phone had wiped itself or updated weirdly, so I tried calling my mom. It rang once, then cut to silence. Not voicemail, not a dead tone, just nothing. I put the phone down and stared at the wall. That night, I found something under the bathroom sink while looking for extra pads. It was a hospital bracelet. My name was on it. Underneath, in smaller print, it said, OB Ward. The date was old. I squinted at it. It looked like it had been printed weeks ago. But that couldn't be right. I brought it to Neil. "Is this mine?" I asked. He didn't even look. "Yeah, probably." "Why is the date wrong?" He rubbed his forehead and said, "You should try to rest." That was it. No explanation, no confusion, just a flat answer and an excuse to avoid talking about it. I started feeling like I was the only one seeing these things. The next morning, I looked in the mirror while brushing my teeth and froze. I was still big. My stomach hadn't gone down the way I thought it would. Not just post-pregnancy swelling, just looked like I was still carrying. I poked at it, lifted my shirt. No stitches, no scar, just a round, firm belly. I checked the scale. I was the same weight as I was before delivery. Exactly the same. Not even a pound off. Something was wrong. I went into the nursery and picked up Eliza. She was light, too light. Like she didn't have bones, or maybe like her body wasn't full. I tried bouncing her gently, and her head flopped weirdly to the side, then snapped back like it was on a spring. I panicked. I laid her down in the crib and just stared. My hands were shaking. Neil came in a few minutes later. "What are you doing?" he asked. I don't think she's okay." He looked at the crib, then at me. "She's fine." "But she's not crying. She won't eat. She just lies there. She doesn't move." He walked over, looked down at the empty crib and then back at me. "There's nothing there," he said quietly. I thought he was messing with me. "Neil, what are you talking about? She's right there." His eyes welled up. I'd never seen him cry before, not even when his dad died. "Please," he whispered. "Please stop. You're not ready. I get it. But we can't keep doing this." And then he left the room. I didn't move from the nursery for a long time. I sat on the floor, knees pulled up to my chest, and just stared at the crib. Eliza was still there, swaddled, sleeping. I could see her. I could hear her faint little breaths, that whisper of air moving through her tiny nose. But Neil said she wasn't. I thought maybe he was having a breakdown. Maybe he wasn't coping well. Maybe this was his version of postpartum. I had read dads also suffer from postpartum depression. Maybe Neil needs help to get through this. But then things started shifting. Little things at first. The hallway outside the nursery seemed longer than I remembered. The picture frames on the wall were our wedding photos, but the faces were blurred. Not out of focus or smudged, but not quite right. Like someone tried to draw us from memory and got the eyes slightly off. The kitchen was quiet, too quiet. No hum from the fridge, no ticking from the wall clock, just silence, thick and humming in its own way. I tried turning on the TV. Nothing, just a frozen screen. No static, no image, just black with a slight glow. The remote didn't work. Even the buttons on the set did nothing. I went to check the mail, needing something, anything normal. The mailbox was empty. Not just no letters, empty, clean inside, like no mail had ever been delivered there. The flag wasn't even attached. Back inside, I started opening drawers, looking for proof of something. Bank statements, receipts, photos, anything real. But all I found were piles of blank paper. Some sheets looked like they had faint writing that had been erased. Others were pristine, never touched. I picked up the baby monitor from the nightstand. It was turned off. I turned it on. The screen flickered, then filled with static. Not white noise, gray static, like in old television. No sound, no image, just that grainy fuzz, like it was reaching for a signal that didn't exist. I turned it back off and went to Eliza's room. She was still there, still sleeping. I sat beside the crib and whispered her name. Eliza? Baby girl, can you hear me? She stirred slightly. One hand lifted, and her fingers twitched like she was trying to grab something. I stayed like that for a while, talking to her softly, brushing her cheek, trying to pretend everything was okay, telling myself it was hormones or exhaustion or both, that I was just overwhelmed and needed sleep. That night, I went to bed with her beside me. I don't remember falling asleep. I woke up gasping, not from a nightmare, just as if air was gone from my lungs, like I'd forgotten to breathe. My mouth was dry, and I was drenched in sweat. Neil was sitting in the corner of the room, in the old armchair we never used. His hands were on his knees. His eyes were closed. "What are you doing?" I whispered. He didn't answer. I looked down at the bed. Eliza wasn't there. I jumped up, heart pounding, and ran to the nursery. Empty crib. No blankets, no mobile, just an old wooden frame with chipped paint and no mattress. I backed out slowly, turned around, and Neil was suddenly standing in the hallway. "You have to stop," he said, voice low and strained. "You're hurting yourself." "Where is she?" Neil didn't answer. He just stared at me, and something about his face. It wasn't quite right. Too still, too calm, like he was barely holding something back. "She was here," I whispered, panic rising. "She was just here." He shook his head. "You weren't supposed to wake up yet." "What does that mean?" You weren't ready. Not then. Ready for what? He took a slow breath. To say goodbye. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the floor, sobbing. I wanted to scream at him, shake him, find her. I needed to find her. I pushed past him and ran into the bathroom. The mirror was covered with a sheet. I yanked it off. I barely recognized the face staring back at me. My hair was dull, tangled. My skin was pale, almost yellowish. My eyes were sunken. And under the hospital gown I now realized I was still wearing, there was no scar, no pads, no bandages, just that same rounded belly. I dropped to the floor and sobbed. This wasn't real. None of this was real. I crawled back to the bedroom, pulling the blanket to my chest, needing to hold Eliza just one more time. Neil was gone. The room was gone. I was in a hospital bed. My mouth was dry. My body ached everywhere. Machines beeped beside me. A nurse walked by the door but didn't look in. The walls were beige. A television was mounted above me, turned off. A clipboard hung at the end of the bed with my name on it, and underneath it, unresponsive, 17 days post-MVA, stillbirth at delivery. Stillborn? I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The beeping of the monitors grew louder, or maybe I just finally started hearing them. Stillborn. The word echoed through me, cold, heavy, final. I lay there, staring at the beige ceiling. I couldn't move. I didn't want to. Every part of me hurt, but not in a physical way. It was like my soul had collapsed in on itself. A kind of pain that didn't have a name. I didn't remember anything. Just the quiet rain on the windshield, Neil's hand over mine, and then nothing. Then Eliza, my imagined Eliza. She wasn't real, but she felt real. All the nights I held her, the tiny weight of her head against my chest, her warm little fingers wrapping around mine, her hiccupy laugh, the way she kicked her legs when I wiped her down after a feeding, that tiny spot behind her right ear where her skin was just a little darker. How could something not real feel that specific? I started to cry, not the messy, wailing kind, just slow, tired tears that soaked into the pillow beneath me. Time passed. I don't know how long. Eventually, the door opened again. This time, Neil stepped in. His face was pale and exhausted. His eyes were rimmed red, dark circles underneath, and there was a thin scar across his forehead, still pink and healing. One of his arms was in a brace. He looked older. He came to the side of the bed and took my hand. His touch was warm, real. "Hi," he whispered, voice cracking. I couldn't speak. I tried, but only a wheeze came out. Still, my fingers tightened around his. That was enough. He dropped his head onto my hand and sobbed. The kind of cry you only hear from someone who's lost everything, but is still hoping, just barely, that something might come back. "I miss her too," he whispered. His voice broke around the words, and when he looked up at me again, his eyes were glassy and tired. "You don't remember any of it?" he asked. I shook my head, slowly. He exhaled, like he'd been holding it in for days, maybe longer. "We were on our way to the hospital that morning. You'd started having contractions. It was raining." He paused. "A delivery truck ran a red light, hit the side of the car, right where you were sitting." His grip on my hand tightened a little. They got you out, barely. You had a head injury, some internal bleeding. They had to stabilize you before doing anything else." His lips trembled. "She was born, but she was too small. Her lungs weren't developed enough. They tried. They really tried." I couldn't breathe. The sterile hospital air felt thick in my lungs. "I held her," he said quietly. "She had your nose and these tiny hands." His voice caught in his throat. "She was beautiful." I closed my eyes. I couldn't stop the tears now. And just like that, it broke open in me. Not the illusion, not the dream, the acceptance. Eliza was gone. She had never cried, never opened her eyes, never taken a breath. But in here, in my mind, she had lived. Even if it was just for a little while, I had held her. I had memorized her face. I had sung to her. Maybe that's why I created that world. Because my body never got to say hello, so my mind refused to say goodbye. But now, it was time. That night, I dreamt of her one last time. We were in the nursery. She was in my arms, wrapped in the same pink blanket. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and knowing. "Mommy has to go now," I said softly. She blinked, then reached up and touched my cheek with her tiny hand. And then she smiled, just once. The world around us started to fade. The colors, the walls, her crib, all of it dissolving into white. I kissed her forehead. "I love you, Eliza. Always." Then I let go. I woke up in the hospital room to morning sunlight filtering through the blinds. The machines were still beeping, steady and calm. Neil was asleep in the chair beside me, hand still holding mine. I looked down at my arms, empty, but not hollow. For the first time since everything happened, I could breathe again. The pain was still there, probably always would be, but something had shifted. I had said goodbye, and now I could begin to heal. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed it, then comment down below and let me know what you think. I'll see you next time with another story. Until then, keep smiling and don't forget to like and subscribe.